Welcome, everyone. I'm Zach Farber, Berkeleyside's editor-in-chief, and it is so great to be with you all here tonight. And it's always just a real pleasure when we get together with our Berkeleyside readers and the Berkeley community. And I hope some of you will take some time after the program to introduce yourselves to us at Berkeleyside and to some of the people on your left and on your right. You know, at its core, Berkeleyside is here to help you understand what's happening in our city and why it matters. We focus on reporting that holds people in power accountable, asks hard questions, and reflects the real information needs of the city's communities. And I often think of journalists as stewards of a shared reality, which means that what you read in our reporting should really be what you see on our streets as you walk around. And at a time when that shared reality can feel fragile, when trust in institutions, including the press, is being tested, this work becomes even more important. Because local news is where trust begins. So I just want to know by a show of hands, how many of you are already regular readers of Berkeleyside in this room? Basically everyone. And how many of you have sent in tips to our email? A lot of you, that's great. Would love to get more tips. That's really where a lot of our best story ideas come from, so please keep those coming. And how many of you have supported our work with a donation in the past? Well, that's also great to see. Our nonprofit newsroom relies on the support of our readers to survive and thrive. And becoming a member is how we can continue bringing you the stories that matter. Berkeleyside is now 17 years old, and in independent local news, that is ancient. And while we're proud of that history, we're even more focused on what comes next. So late last year, we launched a new higher education beat, bringing on board Felicia Mello. And she's the first full-time reporter in Berkeleyside history who's tasked mostly with covering UC Berkeley. And so we launched this beat with the support of a group of generous local donors and the nonprofit organization Open Campus. And we launched it at a time when higher education is under attack, when UC is in a fight for its future. And tonight we're here to talk about the state of free speech at UC Berkeley. Cal is a place that's deeply tied to the history of the free speech movement, and where these questions still reverberate today. So Felicia is going to be talking with our panelists about how Cal can continue to support free speech and academic freedom at a time of real and growing challenges, and what the university's track record has been over the past year since Trump took office. And so Berkeley obviously has a long and history of passionate debate, and tonight is part of that tradition. And we ask that everyone engage with respect and civility so we can hold space for a wide range of perspectives and keep the conversation constructive. We are going to be including questions submitted by the community both in advance and during tonight's event. And so there are some flashcards scattered around the room. Please pass them and share them with your neighbors. And if you have a question for the panel, fill out one of the cards, and we're going to be collecting them a few times throughout the evening. And if you need a card or a pencil, just raise your hand and we'll get one to you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Felicia Mello. Ananya Rupanagunta, editor-in-chief and president of the Daily Californian. Ussama Makdisi, professor of history and chancellor's chair at UC Berkeley. Chris Hoofnagle, secretary of the Berkeley Initiative for Freedom of Inquiry and professor of law in residence at UC Berkeley. And Benjamin Hermalin, executive vice chancellor and provost at Cal.
Well, hello. It's great to be here with this fantastic panel. Really appreciate everyone coming out. Tonight we're going to be talking about free speech, and we'll also be talking about academic freedom. So scholars often make a distinction between these two ideas. On the one hand, free speech, the protection that the Constitution gives any of us to say what we want with a few limitations without being restrained by the government, including by a public university. And on the other hand, academic freedom, the right of faculty to freely discuss and research ideas according to the standards of their profession without interference. And as university administrators often point out, some things that qualify as constitutionally protected speech are not necessarily protected under academic freedom. For example, if a professor does unethical things like plagiarizing or abusing and bullying their students. So these concepts are not the same, but they're intertwined, and we'll be talking about both of them tonight. As Zach alluded to earlier, this is not an abstract discussion. We're having this discussion at a moment when we're 7 weeks into a war between the US, Iran, and Israel that has spread to various parts of the Middle East, already killed thousands of people, and shaken the world economy. Within the United States, the basic norms of democracy and rule of law are increasingly under attack. These are all important questions to be discussing at a university. And at the same time, we have a federal government that has shown interest in applying pressure on universities to comply with its political vision, whether that's through lawsuits or threats of revocation of funding. So it's an interesting moment. We asked readers to submit questions in advance of this event, and one person simply wrote, "How will we survive this current time?" That's a question that many of us probably empathize with. So the stakes are high. They're also high because of UC Berkeley's stature as the world's leading public research university. When the university recently settled a lawsuit with the Brandeis Center over allegations of campus antisemitism, the specifics of the settlement raised some questions about academic freedom, which we'll probably be discussing later. And I was interviewing a student about the settlement, and the student said, they were critical of the settlement. They said other universities are going to follow Berkeley's lead. And I think that's true on a lot of questions, regardless of your view on that particular settlement. It's clear that that's true, that what happens here has a ripple effect and can set a precedent for other campuses, not only in the University of California, but really throughout the country. As a reporter covering campus for the past few months, I've heard almost everyone I interviewed express a commitment to free speech and to academic freedom. And yet it's clear that there are some deep strategic and tactical differences among different segments of the community. And so we'll be talking about those tonight, and we'll also be talking about points of commonality. And here's where I was going to remind you to please be respectful in the discussion, but Zach already did that, so we'll skip that part. One last item, some of the fiercest debates around academic freedom have come in the context of faculty disciplinary cases. We're lucky to have Provost Hermalin here with us tonight, and the university's lawyers have advised him that California law prohibits him from talking about individual disciplinary cases. So you might hear me asking him some questions about faculty conduct in a much more general way, and you may hear him responding in a general way, and that's why. So without further ado, we're going to kick it off with our first question. And what we had asked the panelists to do is to give Berkeley a letter grade, UC Berkeley a letter grade for how well it's promoted the values of free speech and academic freedom over the past year, and say why. So we're going to do this in alphabetical order, and Provost Hermalin, we're going to start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate being here. So I'm known for being a hard grader. So I'm going to give us an A-. Why an A- and not an A? Well, we've been really working very hard to defend academic freedom and free speech. But where I think we have failed to do it perfectly is we have not convinced our constituents that we're doing it. We have not provided them that kind of confidence that we are out there protecting free speech and academic freedom. So I'll give us an A-.
Succinct. Professor Hoofnagle?
I'd actually give Berkeley an A. I think we have a very good story to tell. There is a deep free speech and academic culture at the institution, a long history of protecting professors when they have been called for discipline. An example, my colleague John Yu managed to survive a lot of controversy. What I'm worried about, in addition to teaching people the values and convincing people the values, is we're entering a phase where we might have weaponized complaints of harassment and hostile environment and so on. And that's coupled with a complaint mechanism that's very easy to use. It's possible to file anonymous complaints, and our policy covers conduct going back to infinity. So if you said something wrong 20 years ago in class, you could have a complaint. And under our system, from an anonymous person. The other thing I'm worried about is the heckler's veto. And we've had a number of incidents on campus, despite taking many precautions. We've had situations where people have been shouted down by intolerant people. And it tends to have a valence. It tends to be a certain type of speaker who is shouted down.
Thank you. Professor Makdisi?
Well, I mean, every professor should tell you, or will tell you, or often will tell you, it depends. And so I would say I'm a liberal grader. I'm a very easy grader, typically. So compared to UCLA, A. Compared to Columbia, A. But if you are a lecturer who was disciplined for fasting for Gaza to protest the Gaza genocide, well, that's a very different grade. If you are a student here who is protesting, whether a Palestinian student, a Jewish student, a Christian student, a Muslim student, any student who's protesting, for example, what they think of as depravity, and they are being intimidated and punished or threatened with punishment, well, that's a very different grade. But again, I really appreciate the fact that it really depends on the perspective and where we're sitting.
Ananya?
Yeah, I mean, as a student, I don't like grades at all. But yeah, but if I'd had to give one, I would say maybe a B minus. I think speaking, especially as someone who's been in the newsroom over the last 2 years, it kind of gets to the point that Hermalin was talking about, like, what do people actually feel on the ground? Like, are students really feeling that their free speech is protected when it's been incredibly hard to get people to speak on the record out of fear of retaliation? Do students feel like their speech is protected when almost every protest you feel the need to wear masks because you have to hide your identity to speak up for what you believe is right? Yeah.
A lot of nuance in those answers there. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So a few things I wanted to pick up on. Provost Hermalin, you said that you feel like we haven't done a good job giving our constituents confidence that we're fighting for academic freedom and free speech. Talk a little bit more about that. Are there places over the last couple of years where you feel the university could have done things differently to really make that case?
Well, to Ananya's point about people feeling afraid, I get that. We live in a society where, independent of anything the university would do, and the university isn't going to do anything, people are worried about being doxxed, they're worried about what happens in their future things, and these are things that we, as a university, really have very limited ability to address. But we do not punish people for protesting. We have lots of protests on the campus. We have speakers from a variety of different perspectives come to the campus. We make it possible for them to speak. Lots of controversial speech on this campus. People do not get punished for it or disciplined for it. So, I think the real issue is giving people some confidence that they can speak up and not fear repercussions. Because there won't be repercussions from the university, for sure.
Yeah, and how do we create that confidence? I mean, as a reporter, and this I think came up a little bit in, Professor Makdisi's answer, right? How protected you feel and how protected you feel your rights are by the university may depend on where you stand. And listening to people as I've been reporting over the past few months, it does seem clear that there is some perception among students and faculty that rules, whether it's about faculty conduct or in some cases protest, are not always being applied evenly in a content-neutral way. And you see this kind of disparity where, I think listening to administrators, there's an intent, right, to apply rules in a content-neutral way. And then if you look at sort of the major incidents that UC Berkeley has experienced, say, over the last year, where these issues have come to light, they often have centered around, in some way, pro-Palestinian speech and the question of whether it is appropriate or whether there is anti-Semitic content in that speech. And so I'm curious, how do you square that perception with really the expressed desire by the university to pursue your policies in a way that is content neutral?
Well, I'll give a slightly pedantic answer, if I might. And one of the problems that we face is that we as the university can't say, who we've applied discipline to, right? So the people, if a lot of people, you're seeing only the people who say discipline has been applied to me, right? And so you're sampling on essentially the dependent variable. And so making inferences. One of the first things you learn in statistics class is don't sample on a dependent variable. It'll lead you to bad inferences. This is the pedantic part. Sorry, I'm a professor. And so I think it does create a distorted view of what's going on. There are many discipline cases that you don't know about because we don't announce it and the person who's been disciplined doesn't announce it. There's also many, many cases where people have alleged things where nothing happens because it's not a violation of policy. And that's in fact the vast majority of the cases on this campus.
Can you talk a little bit, I'm going to go actually to you briefly, Professor Hoofnagle. I want to talk a little bit more about what you raised about complaints. And briefly, I just wanted to go back to this sort of broader question of the tenor of how confident people feel speaking out in the university. We had a question from a Berkeleyside reader that said, I was a Cal student between 1965 and 1970. I felt free speech prevailed. Now people are more careful with their words and self-censor. How did the transition happen? And so, I want to get more specifically to what you raised about complaints, but first, if you could speak to, I know you've been on campus for a couple decades now, and what's your take on how people's confidence to speak freely has evolved in that time?
It's a fair point. I think technology has a lot to do with it. So the protests that I engaged in and when I was in college are not recorded in any way. And so there is this problem that facial recognition can be applied to photographs of people in public, and then your opinions when you're 19 become tacked to you when you apply for a job later in your life. And I think this is something young people have to deal with that my generation did not have to deal with. Say that part of running a free inquiry organization at Berkeley has been to support other people and to tell them we will stand behind you if there is a cancellation attempt or some type of discipline attempt. So part of what it is acting it out, is being confident and acting confident and knowing that there are a group of people who will protect you. I think at the core, what we've been trying to convince people of, or the idea that we've been trying to convey, is that it is counterintuitive, even unnatural, to protect the speech of people who disagree with you. And this is the standard that we're trying to live up to, is to protect people even when we disagree with them. And when we create that culture, I'm hoping that more people will be confident to speak.
Ananya, maybe you can speak a little bit more to what it's been like for your reporters out there in the field, speaking to students and the degree to which they feel confident talking on the record, speaking freely in their classes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk about this in like two cases. I think one in the context of, the current administration, I think has changed a lot in the ways in which we've had to interact with sources. In the past, certain conflict, including Israel-Palestine, we would go in with the expectation that not a lot of people would want to speak or give public comment, and that has since increased over the past year. And then also, with the visa revocations and just general federal intimidation, anxieties about getting a job if you are on record in public discourse online. All of that has just led to like a difficulty to get people to talk to us on record. We've received a lot more anonymity requests and things like that. And I kind of want to go back actually to the question that you asked Professor Hermalin about the Palestine exception, because I was thinking a lot about that, and especially in this context of 1-2 years, and it's something that as a reporter before Trump still had to deal with, because I think generally within a lot of like the pro-Palestinian circles, there is like this intimidation to come up and file complaints or voice your concerns because of doxing. Like I remember the first couple of times in which I reported on these communities was before the October 7th, 2023. And it was because there were these trucks going around campus that had lists of names of pro-Palestinian Berkeley law students. And then I wrote another article about doxing on like various websites where students' names and faces had been published. So generally speaking, and yes, the university is not the one who necessarily is intimidating or attacking the speech of these students, but when you are within the academic boundaries and are still facing this kind of like threat to your privacy and intimidation in your specific community, like that restricts your ability to exercise your speech, to give public comment, to file complaints in academic settings, which I think, is an important thing to consider when you talk about what the Palestine exception means.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think sometimes you hear that from administrators that one of the factors they take into account, and I think we have actually spoken about this previously, Provost Hermalin, but I'm interested in your take. One of the factors driving which cases get investigated, become high profile, is the complaint process, right? Inevitably, right? That the university gets complaints, they need to respond. And I wonder how the university accounts for the kind of dynamic that Ananya is talking about, where people may feel intimidated to file complaints, to speak up, and when there also are external factors, right, that we've been discussing affecting the university. When you have a federal government, for example, where the Justice Department is quite interested in investigating potential cases of antisemitism or discrimination against white men, less interested maybe in investigating other kinds of discrimination cases. So as a university, how does the university sort of parse all that information that's coming at them and see, okay, are these complaints reflective of the dynamic and an actual problem on our campus? Are they more reflective of who feels in this moment empowered and has the resources to be filing complaints? How do you account for that?
That's a great question, and it's challenging. We're legally obliged to respond to complaints when they come in. And the fact that some people may feel intimidated from making complaints is something that we would like to combat. Professor Makdisi knows that when we've met with the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Muslim and Palestinian Life, we try to encourage people who say, I've been discriminated against, to file complaints. They may or may not think the process is fair, and that's unfortunate. But we do try to encourage people to apply or to file complaints when they have them. But I certainly understand that there are a number of people who do feel intimidated from doing it, and that's unfortunate because we really do want to see justice done.
I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel. What could the university do to open up that process so that a range of students feel empowered complaining if they do feel that they experience discrimination, and also to cut across what Professor Hoofnagle was raising earlier, which is this potential for complaints to kind of be weaponized by people who may just feel that they disagree with something that was said in a classroom?
We've lowered the transaction costs a great deal to making complaints, such that I think it's dangerous. Now, should people complain about discrimination? Absolutely, because discrimination is where an action has been taken against an individual based on a protected category, so someone doesn't get hired. But what I'm referring to is the idea that there could be a hostile environment from speech. I'm actually not so sure this is compatible with the First Amendment. It's basically a product of the President Biden administration, how they've interpreted civil rights law. I think they've interpreted it too broadly, such that the complaint mechanisms themselves could become censorial. And it's important to think about that when you look at what we consider a protected category, it's very broad. It includes service members, veterans, in all religions. So a faculty member who makes a comment against conservative Christians, or a faculty member who is particularly anti-military, could create a hostile environment, or at least hostile environment complaints.
Ananya, Professor Makdisi, any comments on how the university could adapt its complaint process?
Well, I mean, I think it's more, I mean, I would rather go back to the question, the Palestine exception, if I may,
Please do.
because it is important also to bear in mind that we're also talking about a national climate, as you alluded to earlier. I mean, after all, Mahmoud Khalil was a student who was picked up and they attempted deportation, several other students. And so what you notice and what's happening across this country, both in democratic states and there's a federal level, but then there's also at the university levels, there has been a targeting, quite clearly, a pattern that is absolutely undeniable of targeting one side of this, the Palestinian, those who are advocating for justice, those who are advocating for equality, those who are advocating for a common future, or at least some kind of future outside of the current sort of crisis that we're living in, the oppression of the Palestinians. And so it's those people, those students, not all of whom are Palestinian, but many of whom are Palestinian. The very first student, Mahmoud Khalil, was, of course, Palestinian, is Palestinian. So I think it's important that the question is, I keep wondering, how does that national climate and the huge pressure that's brought to bear upon the university, I don't envy, honestly, and this is not in any way, I don't envy being a university administrator. I can't answer or speak to the pressures they're under, but the truth of the matter is that Berkeley did turn over 160 names. And you know, I understand that other universities did so. Berkeley at least had the decency to tell us that, at least those of us whose names were turned over, that our names were turned over, but nevertheless, our names were turned over. There is, of course, the question of the settlement itself. And whatever the legal sort of, you know, definitions of considering versus adopting an extraordinarily controversial definition, an anti-Palestinian definition, in terms of the examples that are given, the question ultimately is that going to chill people, our students and faculty at Berkeley, as much as I believe Ben totally, because I think he genuinely, and Chris and everyone else who cares about free speech, and I think everyone here does, I think we all agree on this principle that a university should be a place where everyone is entitled to debate issues freely and can disagree as academics and as students. That's the point of university. Otherwise, don't come. I mean, they shouldn't, right? I mean, otherwise, the university loses a key component of what it's meant to be. And the question is, are people going to be intimidated when there's for example, the IRA definition is being considered, whatever that may mean? Are people going to be intimidated? Are students going to think, wait, hang on, is someone going to now accuse me of being an anti-Semite if I dare speak up for justice in Palestine? Is a faculty member going to be potentially disciplined? I mean, and I know the answer is going to be from here because we all agree on free speech and academic freedom, but the point is the effect is already there. And
Can I follow up on that a little bit? Because I'm interested in hearing more about that effect. So as you mentioned, you know, I want to just recap for the audience, right? Last year, the Trump administration asked UC Berkeley to provide documents related to internal university anti-Semitism investigations, and the university did comply with that. They shared unredacted documents that contain the names of about 160 people who had been mentioned in these investigations, but not necessarily found to have committed any conduct violation. So that's what Professor Makdisi is referring to, and you were among those 160. And I was hoping you could actually really just explain a little bit what was the impact on you and on others who you know who were on that list.
I can't speak to others. I can only speak about myself and my own. Obviously, I was surprised. I was shocked. And the reality is I have no idea what was turned over. Nobody told me what exactly was turned over in terms of the specifics. I have no idea if it's an accusation or if it's a complaint. Whatever it is, I have no idea. So I have no way of responding, of course. But you can imagine in the current climate, after what happened to Mahmoud Khalil and others, you know, in this country, what people would be feeling. I mean, it's just normal, and it doesn't matter what. Forget the politics for one second. Just leave aside the politics. Leave aside that we may have very serious differences of opinion about all sorts of issues. The idea of being named and turned over to any government, quite frankly, you know, of course it creates a chill, and that is, I don't think that's necessarily the intention of the university, but that's certainly the effect that's felt. And as the doxing trucks, had a different kind of effect, as you were saying, Ananya, as the extraordinary pressure and the defamation of our students. As I say, I always say this, including Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, all sorts of students who are basically protesting at a university in the tradition of Berkeley, in the tradition of many universities in this country, for what they think of as a better world. Now, you can agree, we can disagree, we can argue with our students, we can do all sorts of things with our students, but above all, we should treat our students as students and think of them as people that we can engage with and educate and teach and learn from, even if we disagree with whatever slogan they may have on any issue, but not to treat our students always as suspect, as problems. And I think that's where, I hope that's what I hope that's where we're going to get to at one point.
So I just want to remind folks that there are cards on your chairs, maybe under your chairs, where you can write questions and send them. Should they send them to the end of the aisle, Becky? And then just raise your hand, and one of our team will come pick them up, and we'll be asking those questions throughout the event. I do want to mention at the time when this occurred, right, UC Berkeley, as you alluded to, said that the University of California as a whole had made that decision, and that the university chose to inform the faculty and students who were affected that this had happened. And just hearing Professor Makdisi, but also hearing some of the backlash that occurred from the community and the campus since this happened, Provost Hermalin, is there anything that you think the university maybe could have done differently inside of what we've been discussing, right? This kind of wanting to communicate to the community that the university has their back. Is there anything that the university could have done differently or would do differently in a similar situation in the future?
That's a hard question because it was not the Berkeley campus that made the decision to turn over the files. This was a decision made by the Office of the President. And I'm not going to question the Office of the President one way or the other. I don't want to lose my job. But I think what Chancellor Lyons did, which was noble, is he went out of his way to make sure that those people who were named in these files were notified. Other universities, as Professor Makdisi has said, also turned over lots of files, and they did not have the decency to tell people. Now, to some extent, that backfired because it created the illusion that we were turning over names voluntarily to the government. That was not what was going on. And I know in other cases, we make a really strong effort to try to get at least names redacted when we have to hand over files. Because one of the challenges that we face is you take federal money, you also agree to a bunch of rules, including cooperating with investigations. And so we always we have to cooperate. At the same time, we try to do it in a way that protects our people. And so we often ask, can we redact the names? We would like to redact the names. You don't need to know the names to know something about the number of complaints. And in previous administrations, that was generally granted. Not surprisingly, perhaps, in this administration, that's been more challenging.
Thank you for that. I want to move to talking a little bit about faculty conduct. Professor Hoofnagle, last December, the university suspended a computer science lecturer who had spoken about the war in Gaza in the classroom, saying he had violated a UC policy against misuse of the classroom for, among other things, political indoctrination. And in this particular situation, there were a couple things that were alluded to in the case. One was that he had spoken to students in a short period after class about the connection, the kind of importance of ethics in technology, and also had made some statements, political statements about the war. And sort of pro-Palestinian statements. And then in another case had referred to the fact that he was on hunger strike in support of Palestine. Professor Hoofnagle, your organization, the Berkeley Initiative for the Freedom of Inquiry, wrote a letter to university leadership expressing some concerns about the decision. And some of those concerns were later mirrored in some policy recommendations by the Academic Senate, the body that represents tenured faculty at the university. Can you explain why faculty were concerned about that suspension and what's at stake as the university grapples with how to handle future cases?
Happy to. Let me start out by just saying that academic freedom is different than free speech. And academic freedom, the reason why professors have academic freedom relates to the credibility of our expertise and the concept that unbridled inquiry is necessary to find truth. Doctors and lawyers do not have academic freedom. So people who are plenty smart, who are professionals, do not have this right. It's a unique right, and it's tied to our profession. And professions have responsibilities. Workplaces have responsibilities. So to be clear, we actually believe that the lecturer was properly censured and punished for politicizing the classroom. He talked about a topic that had nothing to do with his class. Just as I could be fired if I gave a lecture on physics instead of law, we have to stay within our topics. We have to stay reasonably within our topics. There was one aspect of the rationale that we disagreed with, but overall, the rule we follow at Berkeley is whether there's a substantial intrusion of unrelated material. And there's just not a kind of reasonable nexus between the lecturer's speech and the subject matter of the course. And he also was kind of lawyering the situation. He was warned not to do this, and then he said, well, I'm not going to do it during class, I'm going to do it right after class, as soon as class is over. But the whole idea is that professors have power over their students, and we have an obligation not to politicize our classroom. I do not politicize my classroom. I'm very careful about it. Just as an example, when I talk about President Trump, I refer to him as President Trump. And I discuss his legal policies as fairly as I can. And I think this is something we all ought to be doing instead of kind of professing our political opinions.
Following up on that and just speaking kind of more generally about academic freedom and faculty conduct. The Academic Senate has put forward some guidelines for interpreting the UC policy that was at stake here in that case. And they basically have said that it's really important to distinguish between political advocacy and indoctrination, right? So Professor Hoofnagle, you've just talked about how important it is to avoid that kind of indoctrination in class. And the Academic Senate actually made a distinction there. And they said, some traditions of scholarly inquiry are shaped by larger political objectives, such as the liberation or emancipation of oppressed groups, and that those actually can be proper parts of the classroom depending on what is being taught. And they also wrote that participating in political activities outside of the classroom that have an impact on your teaching should be treated the same as any other activities that have an impact on your teaching. For example, if you're providing childcare at home or you have other family responsibilities. So the way I read that is they were making sort of a distinction between saying, to your point, Professor Hoofnagle, yes, we should avoid indoctrination in the classroom, and we need to have some nuance in the way that we view these things so that people aren't punished for simply having political opinions. And so I'm curious, just looking at those sort of distinctions that the Academic Senate seems to be making. Provost Hermalin, would you agree with kind of making that distinction between political advocacy and indoctrination?
It really depends on the context of the course that you're teaching. So, and it also depends a lot on what you're doing. So for example, I'm an economist. I could be teaching a course on international trade. I could be teaching a course that involves lessons about taxation. And I could talk about what's wrong with President Trump's tariffs and why they're bad for the economy and the harm that they're likely to do. That's okay. And people may be persuaded by my arguments and that of other economists that this is bad policy. Where I would cross the line is if I then said, ergo, you should vote for the Democrats in the upcoming midterms. All right, that would be going too far. That's the distinction, one of the distinctions between academic freedom and political advocacy or political indoctrination in the classroom. So that's an important thing. If I was a professor of say, biology, and I start talking about President Trump's tariffs, that again would not be okay because that's not part of what we normally think about as biology. And so, again, that might cause some consequences for the professor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I kind of wanted to just kind of follow up on Professor Hoofnagle's comment. I think, speaking again from the student perspective, what I'm more concerned is sort of like the effects of both and how people interpreted the cow suspension. Because, yes, to some extent, talking about Israel-Palestine in a CS class, it's not a CS topic. But then, when I was talking to students and the newsroom was talking to students on the ground, they were more so concerned, the topic of that specific class was the ethics of technology, in which case you could argue that the use of technology in war does fall underneath the topic of the class. And then students had also argued, again, through interviews I'd had with them and conversations that our news reporters had with them, that someone participating in hunger strikes or activities outside of the classroom, and if you look at if you look at some of the reasonings as to why Cow was accused of political advocacy in the classroom setting, it was like he, because of his hunger strike, was like weakened, and hence that affected his teaching, and arguments like that. So that's a lot of the frustration that students had brought up. Like, here you have this professor who is being punished because of his advocacy outside of the classroom, because he was in a hunger strike outside of the classroom, and then he had phrased Gaza in the context of what he was teaching in the class. So I think that was kind of the number one frustration that students had expressed with the whole parent cow situation. And then I think number two, it goes back to this idea of like intimidation, because it sends this messaging that when you are specifically discussing certain topics, certain conflicts, and certain politics is when it feels like there is, an attack on academic freedom and an attack on free speech. And I think that was sort of the sentiment that was circulating, and the frustrations that were circulating with our student sources in reaction to the parent cow suspension. Just wanted to add that to this discussion. And it also goes back to why, when you had asked that question about like what would I say the university should change about the complaints process, it's a difficult question because I think on the student side it comes down to just a lack of trust in the institutions, honestly. A lot of it can go down to just, they don't feel like the university can fairly evaluate their complaints, or there is some kind of ideological bias, and that makes students uncomfortable to come up with complaints. And again, this is less of something that you can do on the administrative level, and more so just like the culture of fear and intimidation that students seem to be feeling now.
I want to talk more about how we can cut across that culture of fear. Do you want to cut in first?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'd like to say, if I may, just to respond a little bit to what Chris said earlier about the need to distinguish between indoctrination and education. Is that what you said? And sorry?
Well, I'd say method.
No, you said indoctrination as opposed to, I think, education or teaching or whatever. And I certainly agree. Of course, no professor, ideally no person at all, anywhere, should indoctrinate anyone, quite frankly. And I think the university obviously has to be a space where we're educating people. That goes without saying. However, having said that, I think it's really important. It's not so simple to say, well, I teach economics, or I teach about President Trump, and I'm going to call him President Trump. The question is when, for example, two things. One is to remember that we were talking ultimately in the context of a genocide. Now, you can agree, you can disagree, but that's what that's what the UN has said, that's what various agencies have said. We've seen before our eyes, everybody has seen what's happened in Gaza. It's not a surprise, it's a surprise that it happened, but that's what students are responding, and what Peyrun and others have been talking about and trying to draw attention to. Now, you could say, well, technically he's in violation of this code or whatever, but the point is, let's not lose sight of actually what's happening in Gaza and now in Lebanon, in the West Bank and other places. There is something that is completely should be unacceptable. And now, does that mean, again, the question I have for Chris or for anyone, for Ben or for any of us, frankly, is who makes a decision about what is indoctrination and what is proper academic teaching? For example, if we're teaching about the Jim Crow South, segregation, or if we're teaching about the Nazis, for example, do we not have an ethical position that there's something completely wrong about those two things? I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not making any direct comparison one-to-one, so nobody then comes and says, I'm doing X or Y. I'm just giving you an example of how, because I raised this with my chair at one point, and I said, well, how do you determine if a person has an ethical perspective and believes very powerfully in the idea that everyone is equal, and somebody who doesn't believe everyone is I'm not pointing to anyone here, but somebody who doesn't believe that both, of course, have a right to be at a university for sure, but who determines ultimately which administrator, on what basis, does somebody determine that this is indoctrination and this has crossed the line, this hasn't crossed the line? That's a huge question, and I'm not sure we have a clear answer. And the question is, how does it get politicized, based on everything you said earlier and the questions you asked earlier?
There's so many directions to go from there, but I want to leave that hanging for a moment, and I want to address kind of what Ananya brought up about how can we shift the climate so that students feel empowered to speak out in light of everything that we've just been discussing, right? Including the contribution that Professor Makdisi just made. I just got a question from the audience that said, what, if anything, can the university do about doxing trucks and similar intimidation? That's a good question, right? When I was preparing for this panel, I talked to someone who is a faculty member who's in a position to hear a lot about students' concerns about discrimination and moments where they feel intimidated from speaking out about the Middle East. He's particularly talking about politics in the Middle East and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus and what he was hearing from students about it. And he said, when you're talking to Jewish and Muslim students, each community feels that they're policed the most, right? Jewish students feel if they express any sort of connection to Israel, that they're going to be socially ostracized. And he said, Muslim students feel like the whole power structure of the university is arrayed against them and maybe the country. And he said, both feelings are valid and they're preventing students from speaking out. And how do we create communities inside the university where students feel free to express themselves in the midst of everything we've been discussing? And so I'm just curious, to hear from the panel before we jump into more kind of focused audience questions, what your take is, right? How could we shake things up at the university such that we create more of a climate where people do feel free to speak? I'm addressing anyone who wants to answer it.
That's it's a big challenge. And I think it has to do, the question about what do we do about doxing trucks? The doxing truck drives in the city streets of Berkeley. That's free speech. We have no control over it as a state institution. We can offer, and we do, assistance to the students to help them deal with it, but we can't stop that. And that's a challenge. And, to go back to what Chris and others have pointed out, in this day and age where everything you do is now permanent on the internet and you can never escape your mistakes, I can see why people are nervous. At the same time, I think maybe we have to do a little bit of encouraging our students to be braver. I think one of the things that we don't do is to say, if you want to have freedom of speech, then you have to exercise it. If you don't exercise it, you're giving away your freedom. And so we have got to figure out a way, and I realize it's tough, and when you're a young person, it's easy to feel intimidated, and I'm not trying to deny the strength of those feelings. We have to encourage people to speak up, and we have to do that ourselves and say what we believe publicly, recognizing that there could be consequences. And it's a challenging thing to do. I'm not denying that it's a hard thing to do, but I think we need to do more of that on this university. And I think Chris was alluding to that by saying that we have to create an environment where people do feel free to speak up and recognize that they have that right and that's their power.
What we're trying to do is model difficult conversations. We had a conversation at the law school last week with very difficult questions, even inflammatory questions. And I think the way to deal with that is to not feel harmed. You know, don't feel harmed and you won't be harmed. And our speakers addressed those concerns without melting down. We do have to develop a culture where we respect other people who have different opinions. And I think one of the problems with the debate over Israel and Hamas is the totalizing nature of this conflict, where people feel that it is so deeply moral that if you're identified with one side, you're a bad person, and that's it. And we have to erode that feeling that people are so totally terrible if they feel one way or another about it. I think you're right that both people who support Israel and others do feel everyone on all sides of this debate feels censored. That's very interesting to see. And we've heard a little bit about the Palestine exception. I will point out that most of the heckler veto events on campus are actually targeted at Israeli or Jewish speakers. I've been witness to these things. And so that valence is very strong, and we need to get over that culture that you can just shout people down if you disagree with them.
Could I respond?
Yes.
May I respond respectfully? I mean, I wouldn't call it, first of all, Israel-Hamas. I mean, it's people are Palestinian and they support Palestinian rights. It's not about Hamas, we're not Hamas. It's about, so Israel and the equivalent is not Hamas, it's the Palestinians, if you want, or Israelis and Palestinians. I think that's just an important rhetorical, it's an important rhetorical point and an important point to remind ourselves that we're ultimately talking about people on the ground, irrespective of the debates that we should have at the university about, and we shouldn't have people, any person, whatever the view is at a university. I think this is where I hope we're in agreement, that we should have a space at a university to argue the case, to make the case, and to be able to be strong enough, or at least willing to listen to criticism. That is the point, as I said, of a university, at least my understanding of a university. But it's simply the case, objectively, that the vast majority of doxing, I'm president of the Middle East Studies Association. We track all the firings of faculty, the firings of lecturers, the censorship that's taking place. We track all the Title VI cases, what's happened to Title VI cases. I think I've shared it with Ben and with others, the Middle East Studies and the Association and the AAUP report on sort of and I have it here, on the sort of the weaponization of these Title VI the transformation of the nature of these Title VI investigations in the Biden administration and then in the Trump administration. And everyone should read these reports. They're important because I think it's really important to emphasize there's a group of students and of a certain profile who have been doxxed, and faculty on our campus who have been doxxed. There are people who've been defamed publicly. There are people there are the students who have been arrested. And those are all almost overwhelmingly on one side of this debate that we're having on campus. I think it's important to recognize that without denying the fact that at a university everyone should have a right to be able to advocate their case in terms of free speech and in terms of the classroom, argue as a professor or as a lecturer the materials that they want to argue as professors and as lecturers.
Let's take it out of that and just talk about TPUSA, for instance. If you're familiar with the Turning Point USA event, we had this event on campus. The security apparatus to hold that event and not have it canceled must have cost a fortune. The provost might know the number of how much it cost, but those, people wanted to go to that event. It sold out. I was there. I went to observe that event. And the hostility levied at me by the protesters who thought I was there for the event. They thought I was there to go see Charlie Kirk's company. It was palpable, the way people looked at me. People wearing masks, people, quite kind of intimidating. And then when the people who went to this event walked out, they were greeted with a cheer that went, "Fuck you, fascist," over and over and over for an hour. So there is a deep illiberalism at the heart of this willingness to cancel people you disagree with, and it's costing us millions of dollars. And free speech, we should be willing to listen to the other side.
I'm glad you brought up Turning Point, because I wanted to ask about this question of institutional neutrality. And I think it goes back to the question of, how do we make students feel comfortable and on campus? There were students, I think, at the time who were calling for the university to make a more public statement to the students who might have felt threatened by the presence of that event, right? That students, who perceived Turning Point as an organization that had engaged in homophobic rhetoric, misogynist rhetoric, that felt unsafe by the fact that the event was happening, I think we're calling on the administration to make more of a public statement distancing itself from the views of Turning Point. And it really raises the question, right? When is it appropriate for the university? You both were talking earlier about kind of the university leading on these questions and saying, we should use our freedom of speech, right? We should speak out based on our values. And then, of course, that's been a touchy subject over the last couple of years. Chancellor Lyons in previous interviews has said, we want to move the university more in the direction of institutional neutrality. And there have been, criticisms from outside the university of departments and schools that are perceived as taking stands on political issues. And then on the other hand, you have, students in many cases calling for the university to take a moral stand. This week, there's a vote on a student kind of advisory vote saying whether it's a referendum on whether the university should divest from companies involved in surveillance and weapons manufacturing. You could say that's a moment where the students are calling on the university to take a clear stand on a moral or political issue. So I'd love to hear more from you guys, all of you really, whoever wants to weigh in. Is institutional neutrality, should it be a goal of the university in this political moment? And what does that look like, if so? And Ananya, actually, I want to hear from you, what you think students are thinking and feeling about this, because it's been a minute.
Yes, I think institutional neutrality is an interesting question, because I think neutrality in general, for me, is an interesting question, right? Because you also have, because I'm coming, yes, from a student, but also as someone who works in a newsroom, in which, the question of neutrality is also a big one. I think in general, most students, myself included, want to engage in discourse and are fine engaging with discourse, even with conservative ideologies or people that they might disagree with, and to bring in the TPUSA event. But I think the real question comes, at least with TPUSA, was a lot of the protesting and a lot of, students felt scared because, the ideologies that are being discussed at these events oftentimes hurt specific identities and specific communities. And so what happens when it's an ideology that you disagree with, but then also an ideology that is saying that, you shouldn't exist, right? It's hard to deal with as an individual, and then be like, maybe should I take a neutral stand when this person is saying that I don't have a right to be here? So it's a difficult question for them to deal with, right? And I think what I observed reporting on the TPUSA and this intimidation, with the amount of security presence that was there, when you have UCPD and other cops and they're holding the battalions, and it creates this, I think, another third factor of intimidation. It's not just the protesters and the people at the event, you also have law enforcement, and that creates another factor of intimidation. and adds to this, I think, like picture of violence. So, I think like that's something that's you have to consider too. And yeah, so sorry to go back to your questions about like whether institutions should be neutral in the eyes of students. I don't believe that students believe that anymore. I think increasingly, this is a good time to actually ask this question with the ASUC elections. ASUC is like our student government. We're electing like the next body, and there's like the referendums. I think, I don't know if students necessarily believe that institutions can be or ever were neutral spaces in the first place. I think a lot of that could be because with, federal intimidation and a lot of universities across the nation changing the names of their like diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, or deciding not to participate in, Pride. It seems less and less like institutions, they're like reacting to the government. They're taking actions that make certain communities feel uncomfortable. Is that really institutional neutrality too? I think both with the Trump administration and with frustrations over the global events, I don't think that students feel like institutions are neutral or were ever neutral.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Professor Hoofnagle had talked about having this sense of, being shouted down at the protest, based on folks assuming that he was there to attend the event. What's your take on how students are feeling these days about whether events should be allowed to go on when they deeply disagree on a moral or political basis with the speaker's views? Is there a sense that we're a campus where all these views should be heard? Or is there more of a sense that folks want to advocate for deplatforming views with which they might disagree? I know that's obviously there's a lot of diversity of views among the student body, but what have you seen in your reporting?
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily set up that dichotomy that way. I don't think people are like, I don't want to hear the views I disagree with. I think the point I was making earlier, it's not that they don't want to hear, again, like views they disagree with. It's like these are people who are saying that, you shouldn't exist because of your like sexuality. It's not a view in that sense. Like I think if you kind of reduce it down to I disagree with you and hence I don't want to hear with you, that's not really where students are coming from when they say that when they're protesting TPUSA events. Right,
it feels like a threat to their very existence. We're going to go ahead and start the audience Q&A now, and I have a few cards. Feel free to write more questions on your cards, raise them in the air so that our team can come and pick them up. Someone wanted to talk about time, place, and manner regulations. So 2 years ago, the University of California tightened up its enforcement of rules governing campus protests. At UC Berkeley, those rules bar protesters from attaching anything to campus structures, including signs and posters, blocking campus entrances and pathways, camping out overnight, and using amplified sound without a permit. And I'm interested in hearing from any of the panelists, what has been the impact on campus protest at Berkeley since the revamping of those rules?
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit. These rules were already in place, and there was a directive from then President Drake saying to campuses, make sure that you're enforcing your rules, which we had been. And other than a rule on masking, which was part of the state law, the rules that President Drake was encouraging the campus to make sure they were enforcing were the rules that were already in place here. And there have been plenty of protests since President Drake sent that notice. So people, I think, do continue to protest, and we have plenty of protests, and they go off generally fine. I mean, we haven't had any real issues. So I'm not sure I quite accept the premise of that question.
Has there been a shift in the vigor with which the campus enforces those rules?
The rules have been enforced pretty much the same as they've always been enforced. Obviously, we have been, I think, more vigilant on dealing with encampments than we were. In all enforcement is a decision about what's the greater risk, right? So if we go in and we try to arrest a bunch of people, that's usually a bad thing. We'd rather just wait people out if we can. We've obviously have to think about what that balance is, but I don't think the enforcement has changed.
I'd like to hear from the rest of the panelists. Is there a sense that there's been a shift, or has it been pretty much similar to the way these rules were enforced for those of you who were here under previous administrations?
Yeah, I think I agree in the sense that, I don't think necessarily the existence or enforcement of time, place, and manner policies, outside of it being just like, somewhat in reaction to the spring encampments and the protests with that themselves have changed. I do think the perception of time, place, and manner has changed. Like, people perceive as if there's been a greater enforcement of those policies, and they perceive, that the university is like restricting their free speech. Again, whether or not that might actually be the case. So I think there is a perception that this time, place, and manner has restricted free speech. I, off the bat can see that in, people wearing masks a lot more, going to protests, and it's been hard to get public comment. And yeah.
And I agree with, Ananya speaking from a student perspective, but it's clear that there's been mass repression across this country of our students after the national encampments. That's clear. I think there's no doubt about it. And I don't know, again, I bet that whether UC regents tighten the laws, Ben can speak to these, obviously. But the real issue is the sense, ultimately, of our students and students across this country who've been extraordinarily defamed, and and not just defamed, but when the government goes around picking up people and deporting them on the basis of ideological perspectives that they don't agree with, that's why MESA and the AUP filed suit, And so these are really crucial issues. I don't think we can separate the national context from what's happening at Berkeley. I think it's really important to understand that there's no question there's been a chilling, because you can just see. Now, partly you could argue because students protested, they were defamed, and ultimately people maybe are exhausted or tired. We've witnessed the most extraordinary things in our life. I'm speaking for myself now. I've witnessed the most extraordinary forms of depravity I never would have imagined witnessing on my phone. The destruction of every university in Gaza, what happened to the children of Gaza, the destruction of hospitals, the destruction of this. Now in Lebanon, where my parents live, and my brother lives, and my niece lives, and my aunts live. It's unbelievable what is happening. And so people are, and the protests are minimal, because I think students, honestly, they have a million other things to do, but people are also tired and exhausted, and these things go in waves. But I think it would be, I think in the end, we have to also bear in mind that there's been mass repression. And I'm not talking here about UC Berkeley's administration specifically, necessarily, because I think UCLA, for example, was much more intense in the crackdown on its students, Columbia, NYU, other places. But there's no question that the climate has changed. There is no question.
And I'm not sure that we can go back. Part of what is happening here is we're in a kind of vice as a result of Title VI. We now have to cure hostile environment on campus. And so what this means is the federal civil rights laws have been interpreted such that if someone totally disconnected to the campus shows up, walks onto campus, and says something hateful, we are supposed to somehow respond to that. So the campus is no longer in the situation where they can be like the liberal parent who kind of looks the other way and only punishes when it really matters. We are now squeezed with this interpretation of Title VI that requires us to actually address, in some fashion, even the hateful speech of total strangers who show up on the campus.
Provost Hermalin, how is the university administration feeling that squeeze? What does it look like from behind your desk?
I don't really feel that squeeze, to be honest. We want might be the wrong word. We certainly understand the importance of protest, and we want to respect people's rights to protest. Keep in mind the reason we have time, place, and manner rules is because there's free speech. It's important. At the same time, we also have to be able to conduct the functions of the university. So, for example, I have many strong political opinions. If I wander into Professor Makdisi's class and start screaming my opinions and disrupt his class, that's not okay, right? That's something that we wouldn't want to tolerate.
Depends what the opinions are. And it depends what the topic is, but I would welcome you to my class.
It might be a crucial part of your lecture, right? I mean, I don't know. But okay, maybe Chris's class. Okay. Chris looks like he'd be less tolerant of that. Anyway, but my point is that there are reasons for these rules because they protect, the function of the university. And so there is this tension in the sense that we want to allow people to express themselves. We want people to be able to be free to express themselves. And I personally, and I believe the university, wants people to feel confident they can go out and express themselves, but we also have to run the university. And so that's the balance that we have to strike.
I'm hearing in this conversation this sort of layering, right, of the actions that the university is taking, but we're not taking, and then this larger national climate, which is affecting everything and is really, intertwined, right, with people's impressions of how the administration is operating and how the university is operating. Is there a way, in the face of kind of creeping authoritarianism more generally in the country, for the various parts of the campus community to unite in support of free speech and academic freedom on campus? And what might that look like in a way that has not yet happened?
Well, I'll start off by saying again what I said earlier. I think people really have to exercise their right of free speech. And I think one of the things we see in the community is people trying to do that. So I'm sure many people in this audience have been to No Kings rallies, right? That's a way of saying something about the current situation. And those are the sorts of things that people should do if they're concerned about the way the government is acting. They should get out there. They should be public. They should be seen. And we should make sure that our students feel that same empowerment. If they're unhappy with what the government is doing, they should feel in this free country, it's still a free country despite many things that are happening, to get out there and be seen. And I think we have to, as professors, as people who are entrusted with educating the next generation, we have to say that. We have to encourage people to be willing to stand up for what they believe.
I think it's also important to seriously engage with the other side and conservative ideas. I think one of the reasons why we've seen such a bizarre red pilling of Silicon Valley executives, if you think about all the Silicon Valley executives that have kind of gone right-wing in a very coarse way, one way to explain that is that they were actually never exposed to conservative thought. And they had no kind of defenses or ability to think through a more variegated and more sensitive way of seeing the world. For a lot of students, they're only getting one side at Berkeley. This is, the ideological diversity is not very varied here. And so we might think about some more diverse hiring ideologically.
That's, well, I mean, I think at Berkeley, I certainly have many colleagues who vehemently disagree with my politics, with my ethics, with what I consider to be an ethical stand. And, you know, I think, so I don't necessarily agree that Berkeley doesn't have ideological differences on the faculty. I think the question is in terms of figuring, I mean, when you think about what's happening at Berkeley, think also of international students. It's very, I mean, international students, of course, who are going to be absolutely, we haven't spoken about international students, but if you're an international student here, and people are understandably absolutely chilled and terrified. So I don't know what the university can do, you know, or what the university would do. I mean, it's a really interesting question. Would they defend these students in, you know, if they were to be picked up, for example, by ICE? You know, because of their ideological viewpoints, because the administration doesn't like whatever they say. It could be about Palestinian equality and freedom. It could be about any other issue. I mean, that's a real question. I'm not a university lawyer, nor am I an administrator, but I don't know. But I can imagine that being a really important point. But Chris, when it comes to ideological differences, we do have, again, it's really important to underscore, we do have, but of course, we should also have the ability to tolerate differences that's the whole point of a university, you know, and I keep reiterating this point over and over again, but you know, it's crucial for us to be aware and especially be sensitive to our international students and faculty who feel enormous pressure, because even though they have the First Amendment applies to them, they are the ones who are being deported.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to that. I think, you know, I keep bringing up the example of like struggling to get people like on record and public comment, and that is somewhat, you know, exclusively when it comes to international students. Like obviously a lot of our coverage last year had to do with the effects of the administration. You were trying to get international students to talk about their experiences, and that was really difficult, obviously, because people were like, well, if I talk to you, then I'm going to get deported. But then kind of to go back to this question, like me as a young person, how do I feel like I can be more empowered to exercise my right of free speech? I think it's a difficult question that I don't have an answer to, because there's just, like, for example, the last conversation I had with my mom, she was like, I don't think you should be doing all this because, like, what if it affects your chance of getting a job, like, afterwards, you know, of, like, going into the market, having expressed your political opinions that are now on the internet and publicly available, and, like, your employer. And, you know, it became this whole other anxiety. So, you know, people are thinking about what they'll do after college. They're thinking about their international student status here. So it's not as easy, I think, as, you know, as being brave in the political climate of today. Not that I think that students shouldn't be brave or whatever. I just think that the question is now more complicated in 2026 than it might have been in the past.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm getting a lot of questions about the Brandeis Center settlement, which we didn't go into in detail yet. But in the time that we have, last month the university announced a legal settlement with the Brandeis Center over allegations of anti-Semitism, in which the university agreed to increasingly emphasize the definition of anti-Semitism put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. By posting it on its website and using it, among other factors, to analyze discrimination cases. Now, the university did not say we're only adopting this definition. They agreed to consider the definition alongside other factors, and they are using it, you know, they're agreeing to use it more prominently. And this, you know, created some concerns among academics in relation to academic freedom on campus. Professor Makdisi, could you explain a bit about why some academics in your field and others were concerned about the university making more prominent use of this definition, and what the implications are potentially for academic freedom?
I mean, I encourage everyone to read the settlement, and everyone to read the IRA definition, and everyone to read the criticisms of the IRA definition to understand what it is that we're talking about. It's only the university obviously can speak for itself in terms of the settlement itself, but notice that the definition itself has 7, it's not the actual working definition itself. It's the idea that there is no other, as far as I'm aware, there is no other form of racism, whether it's anti-black racism, whether it's anti-Arab racism, whether it's anti-Latino racism, whether it's anti-trans racism, whether it's Islamophobia, whatever the racism is, that's given this kind of definition that the university must consider in this way with these examples, with a parallel set of. And 7 of the 11 examples that are given in the IRA definition are about Israel. And sort of, it is essentially a form, in effect, of trying to intimidate people by saying that if you say this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or if we interpret you as saying these things, then you are potentially going to be considered an anti-Semite. And that has a profound chilling effect. What's happened is that there should be, at a university, a debate. At a university, there should be a debate, there should be a discussion, not about anti-Semitism as such. Everyone should be against anti-Semitism. Everyone, I hope, is against anti-Semitism, as everyone should be against all these forms of racism. Honestly, that goes without saying. But the idea of debating Zionism, which is what the IRA definition really comes down to, the examples therein, the debates around Zionism, and do you interpret Zionism from a perspective of someone who believes in Zionism, or, for example, a Palestinian who is, in Edward Said's famous phrase, the victim of Zionism. Zionism from the standpoint of, these should be academic debates that scholars should decide, and students should debate, and people should have a right to discuss and debate, and have all these perspectives. It shouldn't be a legal sort of threat hanging over your head where you don't know if you're going to, what if I say this, am I going to suddenly find myself hauled before some kind of body that's going to judge me as something that I'm obviously not. And that, of course, and the whole point of insisting on this particular definition with its accompanying examples is, in fact, to sort of force people into this one kind of understanding.
The question from the audience sort of reiterates some of the concerns that you're raising. It says, how can the acceptance of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, a concept subject to vigorous scholarly debate, be squared with institutional neutrality? Provost Hermalin, did I see your hand that you wanted to come in? Go ahead.
All right. So a few things. First of all, consider doesn't mean we're adopting it. It means we are considering it as we consider other definitions. Second, this is not new. So under the Biden administration, the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education said that you had to consider the IRA definition as part of your assessment of Title VI allegations of anti-Semitism. So the Brandeis settlement, I understand why people are concerned, right? But the Brandeis settlement is really just a reaffirmation of the things that the campus was already doing. And it was a way of getting rid of a lawsuit that was draining in finances. We spent millions of dollars defending it before we settled. We would have spent millions more to take it to court. There was always a snowball's chance in hell that it could have led to really bad outcomes, because one of the things that arguably the Brandeis Center was hoping to use this thing for was to really undermine free speech, getting all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court would say, oh yeah, Title VI, it does kind of trump free speech. And that would have been a terrible outcome. So, people can argue about what the university did. They can always argue about what we did. But we got rid of this lawsuit, and all we had to do was simply say, yeah, we'll continue to do what we've been doing. And but there are, and I understand Professor Makdisi's anxieties. If I taught what he taught, and he does a great job. And remember that we have supported him, right? Remember Chancellor Lyons in the House Committee in Education and Welfare, a very hostile Republican committee. What did he say when they asked about Professor Makdisi? He said, he is a fine scholar. I believe that. Chancellor Lyons believes that. So we're going to support Professor Makdisi in his teaching because we believe that he is a fine scholar and he's doing a wonderful job. But I could also understand why he might worry that someone, to go back to what Chris said, some student might try to make a complaint and kind of weaponize that and create some headaches for him. And so I get this, I'm sympathetic to his concerns. And, I'm not saying one thing or the other about whether the IRA definition is a good or bad definition. I'm just saying I understand his concern.
Yeah, we should acknowledge inside this conversation that some people do find that definition helpful for its acknowledgement of the fact that anti-Zionism can sometimes be used as a smokescreen for anti-Semitism. But there have also been broader kind of questions around academic freedom that have been raised inside of the settlement. And I just wanted to touch on them briefly, and this is probably the last thing we'll have time for. We had so many questions from people about this that I do want to make sure we delve into it. The Academic Senate published a statement recently that raised concerns that the settlement impinged on the faculty's authority to oversee the curriculum and protect academic freedom. So there was a lot, as you mentioned, Provost Hermalin, in that settlement that was not new, and then there were some pieces that were new, right, that some faculty members have raised concerns about. And the things that specifically came up, it sounds like from the leadership of the Senate, was that the settlement would give some power to an administrative committee, the Chancellor's Committee on Jewish Life, to examine curriculum and make recommendations about it, and that also the university would be sharing information about cases of potential faculty misconduct with an outside entity, the Brandeis Center, as part of the settlement. So the Academic Senate has asked the university, is my understanding, to involve the faculty in the negotiations, future negotiations about this settlement or any others, and to refuse to implement those parts of the settlement that I just referenced. How is the university responding to those concerns?
So we are not going to not enforce the settlement. I mean, it would get us in trouble. We signed a settlement. But I think the concerns of the Academic Senate, which I understand, and there was an Academic Senate meeting, I think a week ago today, if I recall correctly, where these issues were aired. The academic freedom has not been affected. I mean, the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Life is supposed to write a report on the impact on teaching, but anyone can say things about impact of what the curriculum. In fact, we have Chancellor's Advisory Committee on student mental health, and one of the things they do a lot of is what is the impact on the students of the various things that are done. Grading on a curve, it has an impact on student mental health. So this is part of what we kind of do already. And there's no change in the ability of professors to set the curriculum, to decide what they're going to teach. We're not going to turn over syllabi or any kinds of teaching evaluations to any committee. So academic freedom is still the same as it was before.
Ananya, is this something students are thinking about and following at all?
Yeah, I think a lot of the concerns that students have expressed with the settlement reflect what Professor Makdisi was talking about, like this idea that, and maybe it goes back to the point that I was making, that yes, on the administrative level, perhaps you're saying that, yeah, we won't, impinge on academic freedom, we won't impinge on your ability to discuss Zionism and anti-Zionism, but the perception and the fear that it still exists, right? Like people still feel now as if the concerns that were expressed, that it restricts our ability to talk critically about Zionism, because now you have this perceived, threat. So whether that may or may not be the case legally doesn't mean that it's not that these concerns don't exist or aren't perceived by students and professors.
It seems like that's really been a theme tonight, is both fears about things that are actually happening at the university and then the perception of things that might happen. And it's a challenging climate, and I really appreciate everyone being willing to come out here and discuss these issues tonight. I think we're out of time. Yes. Okay. I think these conversations can sometimes be challenging about free speech, right? They really require us to, sit with some of these really tensions and to listen really closely to people who might have views that are quite different than ours. I think the audience has done a fantastic job of that tonight, as have our panelists, and really appreciate everyone coming out.